thank you all for coming out on this surprisingly cold night. This is an event, I'll just quickly tell you, that's hosted by Journalism Plus Design. We're a brand new interdisciplinary program at the New School where we're trying to overlay design methodologies over more traditional journalistic practices. And one of the things that's great about our program is that we have a good excuse to invite people like Alexis Lloyd, the creative director of the R&D program, the R&D department at the New York Times, to come and visit us. So I'm just going to say like 2 sentences about her and then hand it over. So Alexis is creative director of the R&D lab at the New York Times, where she investigates emerging technologies and prototypes future concepts for media. She also made that robot and instructed it to do those things to the cars. No, I'm just kidding. That's all the time I'm going to take up. And then, so Alexis is going to talk and dazzle us, and then we will have a Q&A session, so be ready with your questions. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, Heather. This is the last robot juggling cars you'll see this evening, but I made a promise in public on Twitter, and so you have a robot juggling cars. I wanted to say thank you to Heather and to the Journalism and Design program for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm going to start out talking a little bit about what we do at the New York Times R&D Lab, which some of you may know a little bit about and some of you may not. We are a small multidisciplinary team of researchers, designers, programmers, data scientists, sometimes multiple of those things in the same person. And what we do is we research emerging technologies and emerging behaviors that we see around technology, and we design and build working prototypes that look at what those changes might imply over the coming years for both the production and consumption of news and information. And so we're generally looking about 3 to 5 years out in our thinking. So we're not building beta versions of new products, but we're really doing research and trying to probe beyond the next couple of product cycles to see what's coming. And we create prototypes because we strongly believe in research through making. And we think that there's a lot to be learned from not just writing or reading about new technologies, but actively trying to apply them and work with them and create experiences around them. The prototypes that we create, which I'll show you some of, take different paths depending on what they are. So some are tools or technologies that have immediate applications or applicability within the Times or within the news industry as a whole. And some we release as public experiments because we want to kind of open them up to the public and see how people use them. And some are more intended to be provocations. They're intended to be kind of tangible artifacts of potential futures that have relevance to the Times. And in order to do this, we are constantly trying to find and interpret signals of change or evolution around us. So today I'm going to talk about some paradigm shifts that we're seeing in the way that we engage in relationships with computational systems. So some of those changes are ones that we see happening already that are caused by new kinds of technological capabilities or our responses to them. And some of those changes are ones that I'm advocating for as someone who designs systems for interacting with media and information. So I'm going to talk about 2 different aspects of this today. In the first part, I'm going to show you several projects that we're developing in the R&D lab that are focused around the act of listening, which I'll talk about a bit more. And then the second half is a bit more philosophical. I'm going to step back and talk about some of the larger cultural changes that these projects are responding to, and to put forth a set of kind of values and design principles that I think are critical for building positive future experiences. So I'm going to start off by walking through a handful of projects that we're currently working on in the R&D lab. And a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment examines a shift from a paradigm of recording to a paradigm of listening. And when I say recording, what I mean is that in the past few years, we've entered into this cultural moment where we kind of assume that we can record and store data about everything around us. The number of signals that we can access digitally has proliferated exponentially. We can record information from everything about, from my heart rate to our readers' behavior on our website to the movement of people through physical spaces. And those signals have become ever highly more resolved and easier to store and to operate on. And this newfound wealth of data signals has been really useful in a lot of ways into providing new knowledge in a lot of different contexts. However, it's also led to this assumption that if we just kind of gather enough stuff and process it in enough ways that we'll cross that threshold from knowledge to wisdom, that simply storing more things or writing more processes will change our understanding. But we think that this approach is too limited, that we need kind of a phase change to get to new and deeper kinds of understanding and knowledge. And in order to actuate that kind of phase change, we need new kinds of listening, new ways of listening. And this means changing both how we listen to those signals around us and also expanding what signals we're listening to. So today I'm going to show you some examples of what we think that means and how we're approaching it in contexts as diverse as editorial tools, streaming data analysis, responsive furniture, and more. So the first change that we think is necessary is to transform and expand how we listen, the methods that we use for receiving, storing, and understanding the streams of data around us. I'm going to start with this visualization that's been developed in the lab by Nick Hanselman, who's one of our creative technologists. And what we're looking at here is every person who is looking at the New York Times web and mobile sites in real time. This is a recording of it, but the visualization shows it in real time. So every green dot here shows people coming from outside the site to a particular article. The red dots are going from article to article. So we can start to see paths that happen and the paths that people take between pages on the Times site. And we can start to see that, break that down article by article too, so you can see where people are going to, where they're coming from. And this allows us to do a couple of different things. So first, it gives us a way to take extremely large and complex data and start to reason around it and ask questions of it. But more importantly, this is based on a different approach to data analysis that allows for new kinds of insights and possibilities. So often the approach to data, especially if you hear people talk about big data, which I only ever use in air quotes, is to collect information in a database and store it there until you think you've got enough of it, and then to sort of run some processes on it and come up with a set of conclusions. And those insights can be really useful, but doing this kind of aggregate data analysis has a couple of different limitations. So the first is that drawing conclusions about aggregate data gives us really good information about big picture trends, like what sections are most popular, when people come to us most on their mobile devices, et cetera. But you lose the sort of long tail that in the aggregate. So for example, at the Times we publish about 300 different articles a day. And in this visualization, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of unique articles being viewed every hour. So there's this huge kind of long tail of behavior and use cases around our content that is not that kind of main, I want to see the news that's important to me today. That's about evergreen content. It's about things in the archive. It's about things that we published 2 months ago. And by looking at data in this way, by not kind of losing all of that when we aggregate it and look at the things that bubble up as trends, that we can start to really understand all of those different behaviors or about why people want to read the Times, what kinds of reasons they're coming to us for. And the second kind of limitation about data analysis in the aggregate is that the conclusions that are drawn tend to be pretty fixed or updated every once in a while. But looking at real-time streams like this allows our conclusions to evolve as the data does. And it also allows for a really tight feedback loop between where we can act really responsively. So for example, a web producer could be looking at all the 2 different stories that are related to each other, but there's not a lot of traffic between them. And you can drop in a link, you can move things around on the page, and you can immediately see how the audience responds. And so it allows us this kind of conversational and immediate responsiveness that's kind of crucial to have as a news organization. So as we've been working with live streaming data on a lot of our projects, one of the things that we've realized is that the tools for building with this kind of data are really limiting. They involve writing a lot of code, parsing a lot of really imperfect data sets, and it limits one's ability to kind of quickly prototype and explore and ask questions. So what you see here are examples from some of the data that we were working with in the last Olympics. And you have to deal with a lot of different data formats. You have to clean up data that's inconsistently recorded. You have to manually look through those feeds to figure out how to parse it. You have to write parsers that never work right the first time. And basically, by the time you get to answering the first obvious question that you want to ask, you're kind of done. And so it's really painstaking. It doesn't allow for a lot of fluidity in the creative process. So Nick, who made the visualization I was showing you, and Mike Dewar, who's our data scientist, created an open source tool called Stream Tools, which is a graphical general purpose tool for working with streams of data. This is an example of a Stream Tools pattern. And graphical means that you don't have to write as much code. So it's a lot more accessible to people who aren't necessarily programmers. The interface that you're looking at here is actually what's processing all of the data behind that visualization that you just saw before. So every one of these rectangles that you see is called a block, and every block either imports or manipulates or filters data in some way. And what this allows for is an easier development process and a really tight feedback loop between data and presentation. So it's really easy for me to make changes and to see those changes immediately manifested. So you saw an example of how we can use this for kind of our own internal audience data, but it can be really used to listen to almost anything. A couple of quick examples. This is an example that is looking at the US Geologic Survey's earthquake feed and is updating a website basically every time there's a new earthquake. So you can also limit this to say every time there's an earthquake over a certain magnitude or within a particular geographic location, it could, for example, fill out a template, email it to an editor for review and publication. It allows for much, much quicker iteration and kind of publication of breaking news stories that are based on kind of sensor or feed data like this. We can also use this to look at information like the MTA has started outfitting some of the train lines with real-time location sensors. So it's right now on the 2, 3, the 4, 5, 6, and the L lines. And so this is showing the real-time location of those trains. This was made by Matt Baji, sitting over there. And then we can also use this to look at all different kinds of sensors that are in the world around us, either ones we deploy if we're so inclined with Arduinos and things like that, or just the ones that are in our phones. We made a quick prototype that made a voting tool with Stream Tools so that, you know, if I'm giving a presentation, the audience can give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to a question, and the web view can show a moving average of all the phones that the accelerometer data from all the phones that are connected to the website at that moment. So those are a couple of basic examples just to show you that this is a tool that's extremely kind of broad and flexible. But Stream Tools has really transformed the way that we work with data in the lab. And the biggest change is that it allows us to ask better questions of data, largely by lowering the effort and cost of asking. And by being able to immediately and easily answer that first obvious question, we can then follow up and go deeper and iterate. And in doing so, it allows us to experiment and reason with live and complex data in ways that were previously either impossible or annoyingly difficult. And it tightens that feedback loop between data and conclusion and means that we can respond immediately to changes or to new information. So this is, if you want to play with Stream Tools, it is open source. This is the GitHub URL for it. So approaches like we're taking with Stream Tools are really crucial to a news organization. Being able to actively listen to or respond to user behavior, to react to real-time news events through sensor streams, to do live data analysis where the conclusions can evolve as the data does. These are all capabilities that enable us to be responsive and agile and to make quick, intelligent decisions and to distribute and present news in a way that reaches the audiences that we want. And that shows you ways that we're thinking about how we look at data, new methods for how we listen, but we also think that we need to expand what we listen to. We've gotten really good in recent years at quantifying things that we can easily measure, like how many steps I took, or how many people clicked on my website, or where a train is located. But we started to ask ourselves, what can't we easily quantify? What are we missing? If you think about all the sensors that we've embedded in our world over the past few years, both digital sensors and physical sensors, it's really transformed our expectations of what we expect to know about our world, about our digital lives, about our bodies. So what does the sensor network of the near future look like? What signals are we not sensing now that we might be able to? And we realized that what's missing from the signals that we have is context and meaning. I'll give you an example. This is my Google location history data for 2 weeks from last summer. Shows me tooling around Brooklyn for a while, and then I took a trip down to Philadelphia for a couple of days, and then I came back. And that's kind of interesting. I guess. If you haven't looked at your Google location history, it's fascinating and a little creepy. But it doesn't tell me anything about, why did I take that trip to Philadelphia? What was I working on? What was I reading about? What was I thinking about? Who was I talking to? All the things that are really kind of the meat of my personal experience. And so we started thinking about, how do you do this? And we've been building some projects around this idea of semantic listening. How do we build sensors for those things that are more qualitative and not the quantitative things we can easily count? How do we build sensors for meaning? So Noah Fian, who's one of our creative technologists, started this work by looking at browser history. And browser history is a really interesting and meaningful signal about what I've been reading about. But it looks like this. It's a machine-readable list of URLs. If I'm lucky, I get a page title. It's not super insightful. So the first thing he did was applied some basic text analysis to the pages in my browser history. So looking at extracting the text from those pages and doing some basic analysis to pull out keywords and topics from those pages. So then my history starts to look a little bit more like this, which gives me a much more textured sense of what I was reading about. And there's also, I love that there's this kind of lovely robot poetry aspect to it, where there's this noisiness to the algorithm, but I can see myself reflected in it. But while this was interesting, it also fell prey to that never-ending disappointment of the quantified self, where it's like, well, yeah, I know I was reading about lobster rolls. That's great, I guess. So we started thinking about how that might be applied. Who might I want to share that with? And the answer was actually my colleagues. So in the lab, we are a group of 7 people. We're a very tight-knit group, and we collaborate really closely, but we all have very disparate research interests and skill sets. And so it would be really useful for all of us to have a better sense of what research and reading everyone in the lab was doing. So we decided to treat our collective browsing as a single semantic signal. And so Noah built this browser extension called Curriculum, and we all have it installed. And it does that same kind of text analysis and extraction on all of our browser history. And we get this kind of group stream of keywords and topics from what we're reading. And this is one view into it. We've built a bunch of different views into that information. And as I'm sure you might imagine, there was a really central design challenge here, which is, how do you create something that affords this kind of intimacy while still respecting the privacy of those who are participating in it? So first, context is crucial here. This is only visible to the 7 of us in the lab. You have to opt in and be contributing in order to be able to view any of this. It's not for someone else to surveil us. And secondly, it respects the privacy of individuals by treating the whole group as a single semantic signal. So we're not tracking URLs by person, and we're actually not really that interested in the URLs themselves, as you can see. We're interested in the stream of topics that's created by the group as a whole unit. And third, it only looks at non-secure and non-private browsing, so no email, no bank accounts, or anything else that I actively choose to keep private. So by opting into this service, we create this kind of sixth sense for ourselves about the research and work that we're all doing, affording greater sharing with those that we trust while still respecting privacy for all of us. These are a couple of other views that people have built on top of curriculum data. Jane Friedhoff made this Today I Learned module, which is looking at the summaries of all the Wikipedia pages that we've been reading. We also have a bunch of little physical screens that we have around the lab to kind of bring that sense of the digital topics that we're reading about into our physical space. So curriculum proved to be a really interesting way of recording our online interests, what we're reading about. And we started thinking about where are other places or other contexts where we have these kinds of rich streams of meaning that we might want to try and get at or build sensors around. And we started thinking about the conversations that we have, the conversations that I have with people in a room. How could that space start to become aware of what those conversations are about? And so we wanted to augment that physical context in which conversations take place to give it kind of superpowers. And to that end, we built something called the listening table. And the listening table is an augmented object that hears and understands the conversations that are had around it. And it's not only an object with utility, but it's also a critical exploration of how we create positive and desirable relationships with systems that listen to us. So I'm going to show you a short video that kind of goes through what the listening table does.
The table is one of the oldest meeting places. At its essence, it is an object built to support the time we spend together. It gives us a place to gather, a space to hold our ideas and let them develop. We wanted to take the table, this fundamental social prop, and give it new abilities, to amplify and extend what it already does for us. At the New York Times R&D Lab, we're thinking a lot about how our devices learn about us, what we're doing, what we care about, what we tend to ignore, and what we'd rather forget. These days, we're assured that we can understand the world if we have enough sensors recording enough data. But there's only so much you can get by adding physical sensors, another thermometer, another RFID chip, another gyroscope. That's why we're working on semantic listening, systems that don't just capture the content of what we do, but also the context we're in when we do things. We build these systems to look for what we care about, not what is easily measurable. They're sensors for meaning. Our most recent piece, the listening table, is an object that hears and understands the conversations around it. The first design principle behind the listening table is that it function well as a table, that it should be self-contained, beautiful, not overly decorated with technological flourishes. But we also believe that when augmenting existing objects with new capabilities, it is critical that those abilities be made self-evident and visible. To conceal such features is a dangerous practice. So the table's physical design is intended to signal a hybrid form, a balance between traditional mortise and tenon joinery and contemporary technology. We use a dynamic microphone array to capture speech from any place at the table. A custom application transcribes the speech and saves it in a database. At any time, people can press one of the touch strips on the tabletop. This drops a marker in the record of the meeting, meaning something important happened. Later, you can check through the digest and see all the semantically important moments, as well as a stream of topics you talked about. Instead of a transcript, the table shows a digest of important moments. Each moment is accompanied by a sound clip of the 30 seconds before and after the marker was dropped. The digest also presents a summary of the topics discussed, so you can recall the flow of ideas that took place. We worry about systems that record too much, so it's designed to forget. It erases everything it's heard after 4 weeks. We don't trust sneaky things, so we made sure it was open and honest about when it's listening. And more importantly, there's only one switch, for when you want to turn it off. Opting out should not be hard. And this is what it means to us to build an evocative object, a durable artifact from a desirable future. We work to establish plausible ways forward that speak to our values, values that we build into everything we make.
So we built this table. So we built semantic listening for web browsing and semantic listening for conversations. And the third place that we identified as having these streams of meaning is in the writing process. And of course, this is particularly close to our hearts, doing what we do at the Times. So we asked ourselves, how might we apply semantic listening to our own publishing process? And one of the big challenges that we have as a publisher, that every news publisher has, is that we need to have very accurate, structured metadata about every article that we publish. And when I say structured data, I mean things like this. These are examples of the kind of metadata that we create for each article. And in thinking about meaning and semantic listening, we started by honing in on these four. We have a structured vocabulary at the Times that has been developed over a century for consistently tagging people, organizations, geographic locations, and topics. And we mark up each article with those tags. So here's an example of an article with all of the people, organizations, topics, and locations that the article is about. And this is important to us because every subsequent process that an article goes through after publication relies on this metadata. Search, recommendations, indexing, topic pages, SEO, ad targeting, you name it, all depend on this kind of tagging and topic extraction. So it's great that we do this, but we do it in a limited way. We do it at the article level, which means that this block of text is treated as a single unit. I don't know which phrase refers to Kay Hagan or where in the article we mentioned North Carolina. And if we had that kind of metadata at a more granular level, we could start to do a lot more with that text. We could start to break it apart and use it in new kinds of contexts and manifest it in new ways. So how do we do that? Well, we can do that with computers, or we can do that with people. This is what all our journalists look like. They still use typewriters. It's not really true. So if we do it with computers, there are two approaches to extracting content. We can do it with carefully curated rule sets, or we can do it with machine learning approaches. And these approaches can do pretty well, but they're imperfect. And on their own, they can't achieve the degree of accuracy that we need to have to put this forth as a news organization. So what about people? People are really great. A reporter who's writing a story knows everything that we would need to know about that text with great detail and accuracy. But you can imagine the problem here. Asking someone to highlight and annotate every significant phrase in an article as they're writing it creates a burden of work that's just untenable. But what if computers and people could collaborate on this process, each one doing what they do best and augmenting one another? So we made an experiment. And the aim of this experiment is to explore what's possible when we apply those kinds of computational techniques, but on the way in, as part of the writing process that takes advantage of the richest source of information we have at the Times, the reporters and editors in the newsroom. So we built a minimalist text editor whose features are provided by external services that live on the network that it's on. And we started with these 4 services to address those Times tags, and each one of these services basically has a neural network that knows how to apply Times taxonomy to free text, to sentences and phrases. And you can imagine many more different kinds of services that you might be able to apply here for attributing quotes, for geotagging, a service that knows about relationships between people, or really specific tools like something that has really detailed knowledge about a specific domain like sports or food. So what we have here is on the left is a simple text editor, and on the right's a visualization of what's happening. It's emitting every word and phrase that the writer is writing onto this network. And those services, when they think they know something about something in that text and they can mark it up, they send that information back, and that gets reflected in the interface of the text editor. Those words and phrases get highlighted. And so what this allows us to do is that this information starts to get highlighted as someone is writing. And then at the end of the process, you can just go back through as you would go back through a grammar check or a spelling check. And you can see what those suggestions were. You can correct them. You can see what other suggestions were. You can verify that, remove it. You can also add annotations that only a person would know, like this is a key point, or this is a pull quote, or this is a headline or a byline. And so you can imagine if you have a whole article that's marked up in this way, like this piece that we did about finding good coffee in New York, and that you could publish that article as you normally would. But you could also take things that were identified as key points in that article, and those could be used to populate bullet points on a mobile app like NYT Now. Or you could take all of the locations that were mentioned in that article, in this case, all those coffee shops, and you could build an interactive map on top of it. Or you could take information about one of those locations, and you could create a contextual alert on a wearable device. And so if we continue to take the approach of creating each of these manifestations as a separate creative work, that quickly becomes redundant and unsustainable. But if we can do things like this that piggyback on top of that existing process of writing an article to create not just that article, but this substrate of structured news content, then we can start to use that to create many, many different manifestations of that content, only one of which is the traditional article. So those are a few projects that we're working on. And as I'm talking about listening, and as I'm showing these projects that listen to your web browsing and your conversations and your writing, many of you may quickly see the dark side of these technologies and the potential for surveillance and abuse. And there are a lot of ways that these approaches could be put to really creepy ends. And let me assure you, the future is going to be creepy. This is going to happen. Even the present's already kind of creepy. So Intel's new mobile chips and Samsung's new TVs, among many other devices, are always listening to your voice. You're probably wearing at least one device right now that identifies and tracks your location, if not your movement and heartbeat. And given these technologies, people and organizations will build systems that do bad and invasive things, either intentionally or unintentionally. So one of our explicit goals with these projects is to investigate how we do good things. How do we design interactions that empower and respect people rather than surveil and disenfranchise them? So a critical part of what we do in developing all these projects is a lot of research into not only new technological capabilities, but the ways in which those new technologies might change or are already changing our behavior. And in doing that kind of research, I've been seeing some interesting challenges and opportunities emerge. So what I want to do is take a step back and explore some of the fundamental changes that we're seeing in our relationships with and postures towards computational systems, and how those changes are at odds with some of the core values that we've been building into our technology for a long time. And then finally look at some new principles that we can start to use to design better interactions for the future, ones where we're empowered to actively engage in negotiations with complex systems. So, as an interaction designer by training, I'm particularly interested in not only technologies themselves, but the new kinds of behaviors and cultural norms that grow up around new technologies. And when we look at past visions of the future, many of them are laughable, not because they get the technology wrong, but because they fail to anticipate cultural change that happens either parallel to or in response to that technology. So these are stills from a video from 1967 that actually anticipates a fair bit about the internet in this segment about video shopping. But then at the end of the segment, the woman's shopping bills are submitted to her husband for review and payment. So it completely fails to anticipate any change in gender norms or roles. So I spent a fair bit of time looking at these kinds of retro future videos, and one of the things that you start to notice after a while is that some of the core bits of our vision of cultural vision of technological innovation haven't changed much in 50 years. So I'll show you an example. We're going to take a look at a video of Walter Cronkite in a smart kitchen in 1967.
This might be part of the kitchen in the home of the future. Preparation of a meal in the 21st century could be almost fully automatic. Frozen or irradiated foods are stored in that area over there. Meals in this kitchen of the future are programmed. The menus given to the automatic chef via typewriter or punched computer cards. The proper pre-packaged ingredients are conveyed from the storage area and moved into this microwave oven where they are cooked in seconds. When the meal is done, the food comes out here. When my meal's ready, instead of reaching for a stack of plates, I just punch a button, and the right amount of cups and saucers are molded on the spot.
So this is the 60s, so it's kind of all about plastics. But we're going to compare that with this video from Whirlpool from last year's Consumer Electronics Show.
The idea here is that all of these appliances are connected through a Wi-Fi network, and there's a journey that consumers are going to go through. The refrigerator knows exactly what's in the refrigerator, so whether you're there and you're seeing it or you're away from home, you can be connected and know what's in your refrigerator. And if you decide that you're going to cook a pizza, let's say, you can select that, and the oven will start to preheat and prepare for that pizza. It even goes so far that more than likely there's going to be a little bit of a mess on the dishes, and the dishwasher already knows the type of cycle that it needs to prepare for, because those type of dishes are going to be coming its way. And just if it does happen and a little kid spill on their shirts, the washing machine is ready to go, and it knows exactly what is going to be expected in terms of stain removal. So the idea is that these appliances are all connected, they're talking, they're smart, they're anticipating the consumer's needs, so that at the end of the day, it becomes less of a chore and it becomes more of a pleasure for our consumers.
So while the tone is different, we can clearly see some similar threads from these visions that are nearly a half-century apart. And when we look closely, we can identify some of the implicit design principles that are at work here, some of the values that we've been building into innovation for decades. So the first is that the computer should do things for me, and it should do lots of things for me. So these systems are designed to relieve us of a variety of everyday burdens, from figuring out a recipe to adjusting the lighting. Ease, efficiency, and freedom from mundane tasks are of the utmost importance. To the designers of these systems, every task has a problem embedded within it. Every bit of labor has space for optimization and greater efficiency, and the potential users might look a little bit like these people. And we highly value this idea that's been marketed so well by Apple, that it just works. In other words, it works without me ever needing to understand how it works. As a consumer, I should never feel the need to look under the hood and view or examine a system's process because it should be smart enough to always anticipate my needs. Mother is a great example of this. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. This is a hub that is paired with these sensors that are intended to track anything and everything from how far you walk, if anyone's in your home, if plants have been watered, if someone left the fridge door open. And the sensors are these sort of featureless white and colored objects. And as you can see from the copy here, each one seamlessly adapts to its task, even when that task changes. And seamless is a key word here. So even the aesthetic design is intended to clearly dissuade anyone from ever having a view into the inner workings. So if we continue down this path, we end up with Doctor Who's sonic screwdriver, a device where nobody has any idea how it works, but it does everything from pick a lock to kill an alien, and it's only got one button, which sounds a little bit familiar. So finally, these systems are designed with just enough inputs and choices to make them seem flexible, but those inputs often reflect the assumptions of the designers of the system rather than the needs of the user. So if it's truly smart and it truly just works, then these are the only controls you'll ever need, right? I mean, why would I want to do anything other than like something? So fine, what's wrong with that? Why wouldn't I want things doing work for me? Why would I want to understand more about what a system is doing when it just makes the right decisions for me? But that's the problem, right? These systems are making decisions on my behalf, and they don't always get it right. They don't always do what I want them to do. And as those systems become more pervasive, getting it wrong becomes increasingly problematic. So we're starting to realize that these black boxes are insufficient, that the systems are never smart enough to do what I expect all the time, or I want to do something that wasn't explicitly designed into them, or one smart thing disagrees with another smart thing. And yet, in embodying these values, they're not designed for me to be able to see why a decision was made, or correct it, or optimize the way I want it to work. And those decisions aren't trivial. Increasingly, they influence everything from the media I'm exposed to, through recommendation algorithms and personalized search, to how my home operates as automation is increasingly integrated through products like Nest and Canary, to what my health insurance knows about my physical status. So increasingly, people are giving their private health insurance companies access to their Fitbit or other health sensor data, which could potentially and almost certainly will be used to affect premiums and costs. To how my car behaves on the road, which becomes ever more important as we move towards self-driving vehicles. To how I find my way in the world, how I navigate from place to place, and what places I'm exposed to or not exposed to whom I may date or marry. And so we're seeing people adopt a variety of behaviors to work around these constraints, to deal with the kind of insufficiency of these black box systems. And I've identified 3 categories of behavior that we're seeing here. So the first is adaptation. And these are cases where I'm kind of bending to the system's will. As an example, and I think this is something we've all encountered in one way or another, where I have to intentionally mispronounce words because a voice control system can't understand me, mispronouncing a friend's name to get my phone to call them, over-enunciating or speaking in a different accent because of the cultural assumptions built into voice recognition. We see people contorting their behavior to perform for the system so that it will respond optimally. And this is compliance. This is an acknowledgement that we understand how we're being listened to, but it's not flexible enough to deal with us, so we adapt to it. And if this is the way we move forward, do half of us end up with Google accents and half of us end up with Apple accents? How much of our culture becomes an adaptation to systems that we can't negotiate well with? And the second type of behavior that we're seeing here is negotiation. Strategies for engaging with a system to operate within it in more nuanced ways. Ghostery is a good example of this. This is a browser extension that allows me to see what data is being tracked from my web browsing and to limit or shape it according to my desires. So this is kind of a middle ground. This is where I'm actively probing a system that's intended to be opaque in order to see what it does and try and work with it better, to force it to be more visible and flexible so that I can negotiate with it. We also see this kind of probing of algorithms becoming a new and critical role in journalism, as newsrooms take it upon themselves to independently investigate systems through impulse response modeling and reverse engineering, whether it's looking at words that search engines censor from their autocomplete suggestions, or how online retailers are dynamically targeting different prices to different users, or how political campaigns generate different kinds of fundraising emails. And then the third kind of strategy we're seeing is antagonism. Instead of bending to the system or trying to better converse with it, break the system to assert our will. So this is Adam Harvey's project CV Dazzle, which involves hacking your hair and makeup in order to foil computer vision and opt out of facial recognition systems. And while the attitude here is antagonistic, I'm deliberately opting out of that system, it's also kind of an extreme acknowledgement of that system's power. I have to change my identity and my appearance simply in order to exert my free will in this interaction. So rather than simply seeing these behaviors as kind of a series of random exploits, I see them as signals of a changing posture towards computational systems. We're familiar enough with kind of the logic of the computer at this point that we understand it as a subject, as an actor with a controlled set of perceptions and decision processes. And so we're creating these relationships where we form mental models of that system's subjective experience, and then we respond to that in various ways. Rather than seeing those systems as tools or servants or invisible masters, we've begun to understand them as empowered actors in this flat ontology of people and devices and software and data, where our voice is just one signal in this complex network of operations. And we're not at the center of this network. Sensing and computational algorithms are continuously running in the background of our lives, and we tap into them for our needs, but they're not there purely in service of the end user, but also in service of corporate goals, group needs, civic order, black markets, advertising, etc. People become not kind of masters of their devices, but human nodes on this ubiquitous and distributed network. And this fundamentally changes our relationship with technology and information. However, that complexity gets abstracted away in most of these interactions. Users are intended to see themselves and maybe the friendly device at their sides. And in this process of simplification, we're abstracting ourselves out of many important conversations and are disenfranchising ourselves. Julian Oliver says, our inability to describe and understand technological infrastructure reduces our critical reach, leaving us both disempowered and quite often vulnerable. Infrastructure must not be a ghost, nor should we have only mythic imagination at our disposal in our attempts to describe it. So what I'm advocating for here are interactions that acknowledge this peer-like status that these systems now have in our lives. Interactions where we don't shield ourselves from complexity, but actively engage with it. And in order to engage with it, it needs to be visible. The conduits for those negotiations need to be accessible, not just to experts and to hackers, but to your average user. We need to give our users more respect and provide them with more information so that they can start to have empowered dialogues with the pervasive systems around them. So this is not a simple problem, obviously, but we start with, what are the counterpart values? What's the alternative to the black box? What's the alternative to it just works? What design principles should we be looking towards to build into new interactions? And the first is transparency. So in order to be able to engage in a fruitful interaction with a system, I need to be able to understand something about its decision-making process. And I want to be clear here that transparency doesn't mean complete and total visibility. It doesn't mean showing me every data packet sent or every decision tree. And I say that because there are these conversations that happen around algorithmic transparency where it's like, well, the algorithms, we don't even know what they're doing. How can we explain it to you? But that's kind of the straw man. So if you think about, as an analogy, when I have a conversation with a friend, I don't know his whole psychological history or every factor that goes into his responses or like what's happening at a neurological level, but I understand something about who he is and how he operates. And I trust that he'll share information that is necessary and relevant to our conversation so that between us we have the tools to delve into the places where our communication breaks down and identify those problems and recalibrate our interaction. So transparency is necessary to establish trust that a system is showing me what I need to know, that it's not doing anything I don't want to with my participation or my data, and that it's giving me the necessary knowledge and input to correct it when it's wrong. So we see some nascent examples of this, like this functionality that both Amazon and Netflix have, where I can see the assumptions that are being made to make a recommendation to me, and it gives me a way to give negative feedback, to say, no, you're wrong, or ignore that input. And it still feels kind of clunky. Like this feels more like filling out a forum than like a fluid conversation, but it's a step in the right direction. But more broadly, I think the challenge that we're seeing here has a lot to do with the shift from mechanical systems to digital ones. So mechanical systems have this degree of transparency built in that their form necessarily reveals something about their function and gives us signals about what they're doing. But digital systems don't implicitly reveal their processes. And so it's this relatively new state where designers now bear the burden of making these processes visible and available to interrogate. And the second principle here, I think, is agency, meaning that a system's design should empower users not only to accomplish tasks, but should also convey a sense that they're in control of their participation with the system at any moment. And I want to be clear that agency is different from absolute and granular control. So something like this gives a whole lot of control, but unless you're an expert, probably not a great deal of agency. Whereas a car, on the other hand, is a good illustration, I think, of agency. So there's a whole lot of complicated stuff that's happening that I can't control. Like, I can't control how electricity gets routed or which piston fires when, but I generally feel that the car is operating at my behest, and I can intervene at any time to make it do what I want it to do. And the last principle here, I think, is virtuosity. And I think about this one a lot. And this, I think, comes as a result of systems that support transparency and agency well. And when I say virtuosity, what I mean is the ability to use a technology expressively. So Edward Tenner, in his book, Our Own Devices, talks about the difference between technology, which are the structures and devices and systems that we use, and technique, which is how we use them. So he uses shoelaces as an example, which I love because it's this incredibly simple technology, but there are varieties of lacings for specific activities like hiking or football. There are lacings that indicate military association or country of origin. Apparently Europeans and Americans do it differently. And color or style of shoelace can indicate everything from cultural affiliation to gang membership. So there are these shoelaces are these things that are adapted for needs that range from functional optimization to social signaling. And it's a simple technology that contains the affordance for all kinds of skilled techniques that become deeply embedded into processes and culture. So it's not just about being able to adapt something to one's needs, but being able to play a system with skill and expressiveness. And this is what I think we should aspire to. And all of these values, transparency, agency, virtuosity, are expressions of this deeper value of having humans in the loop. And human in the loop is a phrase that I love because it comes from computer science. It's this incredibly mechanical, non-human way of talking about, like, how do we deal with people in the system? And it specifically has to deal with models or simulations that have to accommodate the unpredictability of human input. And more broadly, when I use this term, I'm talking about these interaction design values I've just espoused, that these systems should be designed as conversations with people. So if we use that as a framework to look at some of the projects that I showed earlier, when we look at the listening table, it has several affordances that make it specifically a listening table and not a secret spy table. So the lights embedded in the table respond to sound and make it clear and apparent when the table is listening to the conversation. We have a display that shows the speech as it is being transcribed. The touch-sensitive strips give me nuanced control over what parts of the conversation that I want to mark as significant. And more importantly, there's a big off switch, so I can be sure the table isn't listening when I want to have an off-the-record conversation. The text editor project that I showed is very much anchored in this idea of algorithmic systems and human beings having a fluid conversation with one another. The network services have these complex neural network algorithms that are doing their best to help annotate the writer's text, but the writer can see other guesses and has full control over how that metadata does or doesn't get applied, and can make corrections that then feed back into those algorithms to help them learn to do better. And Stream Tools is very explicitly about affording users who aren't necessarily highly technical the ability to actively probe data services and streams to better see data as it moves through a system and to be able to manipulate those streams with a high degree of virtuosity, allowing us to ask and refine questions very easily. So you can see how the work that we're doing is not just about trying to figure out what possibilities the near future will hold, but actively trying to understand what kinds of futures we should be building, how we can wield new technologies in positive and constructive ways. Because while it's wonderful if technology can make our lives easier or more efficient, at its best, it's far more than that. It can give us new superpowers. It can give us new channels for expression and communication that can be far more than utilitarian, but can really allow for true eloquence. So we need to design interactions that allow us to converse across complex networks, where we can understand and engage in informed and thoughtful ways, and the systems around us can respond with equal nuance. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Thank you. So I really just want to open up the floor to questions. We have a microphone over there and a microphone over there, or if you feel like you just want to stand up and shout, I think that's probably fine too. Go ahead.
I guess I have two questions. First of all, with a project like the text editor, do you involve actual reporters in beta testing or developing something like that? Or is the newsroom totally cut off from what you're doing?
Yeah, that's something that we definitely try to make all of our projects as collaborative as possible. We try to bring in people from other parts of the organization that would have a vested interest in the research that we're doing. So that's a project where we're talking to not only reporters and editors in the newsroom, but also like the technologists who are working on our CMS to try to think about how we might explore building these kinds of services into the technology that we use for publishing.
The second question is about ethics, and it seems like there's an ethics of interaction design. And I wanted to ask what that has to do, or how explicitly has that been explored in relationship to the ethics behind the journalism of the Times or other news organizations?
That's a really good question. I think that there's I think that everyone who works at the Times has a connection to kind of the civic mission of what we're doing, and I think that that's a big reason why part of what we're exploring is very much about like how we do good things, and how we, respecting our users is also very closely tied to the ideas of kind of creating an informed citizenry, having people who are empowered, whose data is not being abused, who are not being surveilled, et cetera. So I think there are connections there. Yeah.
You working on scanning all newspapers so that you can now create complete new articles and get rid of your complete repertorial staff?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Can you ask that again? I'm not sure.
It seems as if it would be possible, using the techniques that you now have at your disposal, to look at articles of every newspaper, The Guardian, etc., and be able to coalesce what's the most exciting articles and practically write them at this time, and drop your complete reporter staff. And I'm wondering whether you're doing it in your group yet.
We have no plans to replace the reporters in the newsroom.
I was going to try this microphone thing. I liked a lot of I teach design and technology here. My name is Ben Norsko. I liked a lot of the tools you were making in that they were sort of anti-data aggregation tools, but context aggregation tools. And it's sort of like these tools for capturing like the opportunity to create insight from human intuition, which computers are really bad at. So I wondered if you could speak to sort of the idea of lateral thinking and those types of like sort of human tools and human interactions that our brains are good at but computers are really bad at, and why those are important for news reporting.
Sure, and I think that one of my stances, at least, is that when we talk about a lot of these innovations, when we talk about things like computational journalism, I think that the best possible futures for all of those things involve people doing the things that people do best, and computers doing the things that computers do best, and finding ways to create collaborations between the two. So the text editor is a perfect example of that, where there are things that only a person's going to be able to do well. And we're not looking to replace that, but we're looking to augment that with things that a computer can do well, that an automated system can do well, in order to kind of give that person's the freedom to do more with their their skills. Yeah.
Do you foresee the listening table being sold to the public, or at least the business public, in the future?
So that's, we get questions like that a lot when we build projects like the listening table. These are projects that we build as sort of tangible artifacts of potential futures. This is not because we intend for the Times to be producing and manufacturing tables anytime soon, but it's looking at, what is the information landscape of this kind of future look like? How does, and especially when we're talking about kind of connected objects and connected spaces, that a lot of the research that goes into those is very much about the kind of engineering problems of them. How do I get my toaster to talk to my alarm clock so that my toast is ready when I wake up, that kind of thing. But we're really looking at how information flows through a space that's full of connected objects. What does that information look like? Who's publishing it? Who has the right to publish to that object layer or to that physical layer? And how, what's that interaction between the physical and the digital? So those are the kinds of research questions we're asking. And we find that having a tangible object and a tangible interaction to base that conversation around is really helpful in two ways. One is that there's a lot that we learn from trying to build something. So there's a lot of ideas we could have posited about how this interaction might work out, or how something like this might feel. But until you actually start to put your hands on the technology and create something, there's a lot that you learn from trying to figure out where the button goes and what it does. And then also in terms of having an actual experience to respond to, creates a much richer conversation about what this might look like than having those conversations in the abstract, because everyone's starting from a tangible thing rather than an abstract set of assumptions. Dave?
Hello.
Dave is meerkatting this.
I've been meerkatting this talk, and you've had 7 people on solid the whole time, which is unbelievable. It's now up to 14. We have a question from @MatthewMJ. This is all on Twitter right now, too. Can you share about openness and interoperability with other data and services?
That's a broad question.
Well, it's over.
Yeah, it's over Twitter.
Yeah.
Openness and interoperability. So we, I'll answer that as best I can. We try to open up a lot of the work that we do where we think that it's useful to have that be a more public conversation. So for example, Stream Tools is an open source project. We have a number of open source projects that we've created. We also have one of the recent projects that in terms of open data, one of the recent projects that we launched in the fall is called Madison, which is it's a crowdsourcing project for getting structured data about our historical ads in our archives. And all of that data is being re-released to the public. So I think that that's a value that we hold of making things open wherever we can. There are some things that obviously we can't, but yeah. Okay. In the back.
On the topic of getting the structured data itself, can you speak to the problems? I mean, New York Times has 100 years of articles, and maybe 10 years or so has that kind of metadata. Can you speak to the problems of trying to introduce semantic meaning, like structured semantic meaning, into large sets of data that without, consuming a million years worth of human time?
Do you have a couple of hours? Sorry, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. One fascinating fact to start with is that one of those assumptions is incorrect, and we've actually been tagging our articles with structured data since 1913. When the Times Index was started. So those big red books that you see in the library, that is when we started sort of building this taxonomy, and we've been tagging our articles for over 100 years, which is totally unique. And so that's great. So we actually do have this really rich archive of structured data in some ways, but in other ways, obviously, we don't. We didn't start having, sort of digital text publishing until the 1980s. So there's been a lot of work going back in terms of trying to, get really good OCR text for our archives and things like that. But the Madison project that I just mentioned was actually looking at some of this. So I don't know if you've seen, how many people here have seen Times Machine, but it's awesome. You should look at it if you haven't. It's basically like 21st century microfiche. It's a way of looking back through all of our old issues and, page by page as they were published and zooming in and sort of panning through them. And as we were looking through this, we realized that in digitizing our archives, we had really focused on the news content, obviously. And we hadn't really done much in terms of the advertisements. And they're fascinating. They're this incredible reflection of culture and technology and economics and history. And so we created Madison as a crowdsourcing project for being able to try and build structured data around our archive in that way. And in parallel with that, we also created a project called Hive, which is an open source project that is a framework for creating crowdsourcing projects like this, because this is a problem that many organizations have, publishers especially, but all kinds of people, museums, libraries, corporate archives, where you have these sort of non-digital things that you want to get digital information about. And so we open source this, this sort of modular tool that we built for applying that to any kind of set of assets. Yep.
How do you see the future of visual news in terms of collecting user-generated content on social media and giving the viewer real-time access to that content, photos and videos, and generating visualization from the content as a means to democratize how news is being told and empowering the citizen journalist as the primary storyteller?
I think we see a lot of that has been happening we see an increase in kind of citizen journalism. We see an increase in platforms and tools for people to tell those stories. And we also see growing numbers of tools for journalists to collect and share those, things like Storify. And I think we'll continue to see that, and I think that's a very good thing. But I think that it's always going to be a balance. I mean, especially for an organization like the Times, where I think a big part of the value of the Times is the sort of the journalistic authority and ethics and things like that we bring to bear that are not always reflected in opening that platform up to everybody. So I think it's a balance between the two. In the back?
Not working from the newsroom, like seeing from another perspective, what would you like to see from journalists to change, or which way or content would you like to see them gathering to do a better storytelling? What would you like to see in terms of the news articles that Times or journalists are producing?
In terms of content or in terms of process?
Content. Like I'm asking for the side of the journalist. How do you like to see the articles if you would like to see a change in the content using these platforms and social media and content? For example, data visualization, maps.
So I think
what journalists can do a better job in helping this kind of platform and tools to do a better storytelling.
Well, I think that one of the things that is starting to shift, but I think needs to shift even more, is that especially at kind of organizations with a longer history, we see this assumption that we are publishers of articles. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that articles are one piece of how we tell news stories. And we already see a growth in other kinds of forms of multimedia journalism, data visualization, et cetera. But that I think we need to start thinking even more broadly about the way that we tell those stories, and not only the different forms that we have at our disposal now, but creating content and information that is flexible enough to adapt and grow into new forms that will emerge.
And what can you say about video consuming and producing?
I think that, I mean, we haven't been looking at video very closely in R&D. That's not my area of expertise, but I mean, it's something that we've obviously seen a lot of growth in the past several years. Dave is live streaming this on Twitter right now. I think things like that, like Meerkat, are going to be interesting in terms of citizen journalism efforts, in terms of, you know, what does a platform like that look like, you know, when something like Ferguson happens, for example.
Introduced the research kit. I'm not sure if you're aware. The research kit is a thing that like doctors and researchers can access the information of the Apple Watch and the iPhone, and to like people have to opt in to the program to give their information to advanced studies on Parkinson or things like that. Do you see New York Times in one day asking the permission to access the data of their readers to like track relevant stuff? Do you think that is complicated ethically? What do you think?
So I have a lot of answers to that question. So we made a project in 2011, I believe, called Open Paths, and that was a project that was launched in response to the news that Apple was tracking all your location data on your iPhone and you couldn't have any access to it. And so it was a way of, it was an app, it still exists, it's an app you can install on your phone that tracks all of your location data and gives you control over that. Not only does it give you control over that, but you are the only person who can view that data. Even Open Paths and the New York Times can't view that data. And there is a function within Open Paths for researchers to be able to request the use of your data for research, and then you can give permission to them. So this is actually what Apple's doing now, is something that we built 4 years ago. So I think, yes, we believe in creating really good structures and tools for giving users control over their data and for allowing them, really granular control over what is being seen, what is being used, et cetera. And we try to evangelize that throughout the Times as much as we can. Any other questions?
Seems like the tools that you have at your disposal could also be effectively used to offer more personalized feeds for your readers. Is that something you're already doing or looking into doing? If not, are there any philosophical reasons as to why you're not using those technologies to offer more customization?
The Times site and apps do have some personalization built into them. We have personalized recommendations and things like that. We have done some explorations around that in the R&D lab to think beyond what are ways of giving personalized content that are not kind of the same techniques everyone uses of, people who read this also read, that kind of technique. So we've been thinking about how do you move beyond the obvious personalization into things that might be more compelling user experiences. And I mean, as with the question about citizen journalism, I think there's always a balance there between understanding that people are, that you may never be interested in sports news and you never want to see it, and it's always annoying to you that it's there even though you're not interested in it. So there's a degree of personalization that would be really useful for you, but at the same time there's also this degree of authority about what's important that's going on in the world that people come to us for, and that is something that we need to continue to offer people. And so there's a balance there between those two.
The just words approach. Do you see the general public sharing those concerns? Because a lot of people I talk to and I share those concerns, they seem to have an approach that is like, well, that's what you pay for, to get those technologies. So do you see more people sharing those concerns in the future?
I think that there are people who intrinsically share those concerns. There are people who don't share those concerns until something bad happens to them. And there are people who may not share those concerns, but I think it's important to do the right thing by them anyway. Yeah?
I'm curious about, could you say a little bit more about how you work with the larger organization, setting agenda, how you work with journalists? What kind of relationships do you have with the people who are actually creating copy and things of that sort?
Sure. So we talk and collaborate extensively throughout the organization, from people in the newsroom to people in our technology and design and product groups. And our process is generally that as we are working on research in a particular area, and as we start to develop ideas and prototypes, that as early on as it kind of makes sense to start having conversations about it, we start having those conversations with the people who it's most appropriate to talk to. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our work sort of takes different paths into the organization depending on what it is. So some of the projects are about seeding ideas that then kind of take shape into actual tangible things over the course of several years. As I said, we're looking 3 to 5 years out. And then there are things like when we're working on things like stream tools, which is sort of this idea of research through tool making. Getting people to use those tools is really important. So we're looking at so we talk to people in the organization and get other people to start using them to see how that can be best applied. So it's a range of outcomes. All right, thank you very much.
I just want to thank you, Alexis. That was so interesting. I actually forgot to tweet about it for a few minutes here and there. Thank you all again so much for coming. We do have a sign-up sheet in the back for Journalism Plus Design, so if you want to hear about more of our events or more of what we're doing, please sign up. And then also please join us for some wine and some snacks. Thank you, Alexis.